My name is Penny Mulvey. I would like to acknowledge this land that we meet on today is the traditional land for the Wurundjeri people, and that we respect their spiritual relationship with their country. Our topic is of huge significance to us all, to all Australians, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous. The Northern Territory intervention and the PM's apology. Are they working? And we're delighted to have two such knowledgeable guests join the Archbishop for this important conversation. Our conversation host, Anglican Archbishop of Melbourne, Dr. Philip Freier, has spent most of his adult life working and living with Aboriginal people in Northern Australia. Philip initially trained as a school teacher and taught Aboriginal students predominantly in the Cape York area of Queensland. Then after completing his theology training, he returned to Northern Queensland, first to Kowanyama as deacon, then Thursday Island as priest. Prior to coming to Melbourne at the end of 2006, Philip was Bishop of the Northern Territory for 6 years. Joining him today are Clare Martin and Professor Marcia Langton. Clare has been quoted as saying, in fact quite recently, "There are days when you think I'd be better off at home putting washing on the line." And the federal intervention appears to have been one of those days, according to Clare. Clare is the former Chief Minister of the Northern Territory and the former member for Fanny Bay. In 2001, Clare led the Australian Labor Party into government for the first time in Northern Territory history. Thank you, Murray. 4 years later, she led Labor to a second term with an increased majority. Labor was returned to power again last month, without Clare. Marcia Langton AM is currently Chair of Australian Indigenous Studies at the University of Melbourne. Her doctoral fieldwork was conducted in eastern Cape York Peninsula during the 1990s, and her experience of the statutory land claim and native title system in this region was informed by a decade of administration and fieldwork pertaining to Aboriginal land rights in the Northern Territory of Australia. She was awarded a PhD from Macquarie University in 2005. She is a Fellow of the Academy of the Social Sciences of Australia and a member of the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies. She is Chair of the Cape York Institute for Policy and Leadership. Please join me in welcoming Archbishop Philip Freier, Clare Martin and Professor Marcia Langton.
Well, thank you, Penny, for that kind introduction. I thought we might open the conversation, especially for those who perhaps haven't followed events in the detail that we might come to unpack, by asking Clare Martin just to, from her perspective, summarise the events leading up to the intervention in the Northern Territory, and I suppose some of the impact for you as the leader of a territory government, state government that was having principles brought in from outside your jurisdiction. How did that run?
It's one of those things that, as Penny said, I reflect on from time to time and contemplate doing the washing, because politics can be very difficult. I think just I don't want to talk too long, Philip, but to say that as a Labor Chief Minister, I set about, when I came to government in 2001, to work as closely as I could with the federal government. I felt that our political differences shouldn't get in the way of having a constructive relationship. And I felt that I had a very constructive relationship with John Howard as Prime Minister. We didn't always agree, and certainly I left it to the other premiers to kind of do the harder stuff, and I said to them, just let me have my relationship with John Howard. We work quietly together. So as events unfolded and we got closer to a federal election, I was, I suppose, not surprised, but taken aback, and so was all the Territory, at the kind of the way that the federal government decided to try and score points against the states as they went to last year's elections. And there's no doubt about it that the issues that we were dealing with in the Territory, the issues of Aboriginal disadvantage, were ones that I had talked through with John Howard, had put proposals to the federal government over many years had talked about the very issues that were the focus of the intervention for a long time, very specifically, and had had John Howard congratulate me publicly about what we were doing and the initiatives we were showing, and said the Northern Territory is leading the country in terms of what we're doing. So the intervention, although the issues were important, the way it was done was blatantly political, and that's the sadness of it. It could have been done so differently. We had an intervention that had so many different agendas hung off it that it wasn't about protecting children. It was about a whole lot of agendas that were had an opportunity to be put in place. It was an intervention on Aboriginal people in the Territory. It wasn't a working with Aboriginal people in the Territory. And I think that if you talk to anyone who's worked in the area, that it's a working with, not an intervening on. And that's really what the intervention came down to. I think that the day after the last federal election, when Alexander Downer stood in front of the cameras and was asked about the federal election loss, what had happened, he said, without a kind of moment of shame, he said, we weren't doing well in the polls. We thought we'd try the intervention in the Territory, see if it lifted our ratings. It didn't, so we had to move on to something else. And that really, when you consider that the intervention spent about $1.3 billion, which is more than a third of the Territory's budget, without any real structure to that expenditure. I mean, it broke my heart. It just did. We struggled so hard for funds, and to have the federal government who, would sometimes generously, sometimes begrudgingly hand you funds, to spend so much without any consultation with us and duplicating things that had been done was very sad for all Territorians, and of course particularly sad for Aboriginal Territorians.
You're describing something which I think as an exercise in cynicism, to hear what you're saying. That's how you're seeing this intervention. Have you, in reflection, seen some lasting benefits that perhaps, despite the motivation, have been affected by this vast injection of resources?
When the intervention actually happened, I could have gone two ways in my response. I could have said, this is outrageous, we will reject it entirely. But what I said was, we will work with the elements that we think are positive. I initially said I will not be any part of lifting the permit system. I won't be any part of forcing leases on Aboriginal people in their townships. But I said, health, of course we'll work with health. Of course we'll work with tackling further issues to do with alcohol abuse. So I did see opportunities at the time, but if the federal government hadn't had an election coming up, if John Howard hadn't been watching the polls to see how he could take decisive action, and we saw it happen after the intervention. I mean, the intervention didn't lift them in the polls, so they tried the hospitals in Tasmania. We were doing guessing competitions about what would happen next. Ports, I was right with ports. We said they'll do the ports next. It's just that the issue in the Territory is such an important one that to do it that way and to spend money that way. Just give you an example. A health check in the Territory, the way it was done, and mind you, we have clinics right across the Territory who, with health staff who have worked for years, in sometimes very difficult circumstances. They do those health checks constantly, but nobody's going to reject a further health check. That's great. But each health check, the way it was done, cost $600, each health check. And what it found out was that Aboriginal children have problems with hearing, which we knew, and more funds would have been directed specifically to that if they'd said, let's have a conversation. And that Aboriginal children have problems with dental health. Two issues that are now being pursued, but tens of millions of dollars were spent on duplicating what we already knew. But again, I don't think any parent here would say, if somebody's offering my child a health check, I'll take it.
suppose the idea of Aboriginal people or many issues being caught up in a political campaign isn't new, but Marcia, I know that you took a line that was probably different to what a lot of other Aboriginal leaders took during this intervention, and possibly even expected you to take. What was your take at the time, and perhaps the same thing, how have you seen it unfold in retrospect?
Thank you, Philip. The question for me in the months prior to the Commonwealth Government announcing the intervention was, where was the Northern Territory Government's response to the Little Children Are Sacred report? We waited and we waited and we waited for a response, and there was nothing. And what happened during that time was that the media engaged in their own debate about whether or not the issues that were raised in that report were in fact happening. And so it seemed for the many months following the completion of the report, it wasn't published. You understand that the report wasn't published. It was, I think you said you couldn't find a printer for the report. And then there was the debate on Late Night Live, and you know, that was some months afterwards, and we were still waiting for a comment from you. And the National Indigenous Times ran a campaign saying that none of it was true, that Suzanne Smith of Late Night Live of ABC Television had concocted a story and so on, and there was later an inquiry into that, and she was cleared of all those allegations, and it was found that her reportage was in fact of the highest order. And I was terribly worried that all of those matters that had been brought out much earlier by the public prosecutor in Alice Springs, Nanette Rogers, many Aboriginal women, and then finally by the Little Children Are Sacred report, were, during this long period, it was over a 2-year period, you understand, were being politicised by the media, by the commentariat, to the extent that people no longer believed what Nanette Rogers and Rex Wild QC and Pat Anderson were saying. Now, Nanette Rogers, 13 years beforehand, began reporting on these matters, especially at that time when she was working in the legal service in Alice Springs on the rates of violence against Aboriginal women. And they were extreme back then. I first went to Alice Springs in 1981. I taught at the Institute of Aboriginal Development, and they gradually worsened, and then we had the problem of violence against children, including murders of children and so on in Alice Springs. And of course the problem, as we could all see, was the flow of alcohol, as Pat Anderson and Rex Wild said, the rivers of grog. I worked for the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody in 1989, 1990 and part of 91, and I and my team went to 33 Aboriginal communities, and everywhere we went people said that alcohol was the problem. So our first chapter in our report to the Royal Commission was about alcohol, and we talked about the grog running, the use of Aboriginal people and communities as an alcohol market, and we wrote about the alcohol economy, and we reported in direct quotes what Aboriginal people in most of the communities were saying about the scourge of alcohol. So when Nanette Rogers made her announcement, and I think, you know, declared her hand and said that the violence against women and children is intolerable, and this was a year before the appointment of the Wild Anderson inquiry, it was shocking to everybody, but those of us who'd worked in these communities knew about it well enough to know that nobody was taking the problem seriously. And I was not surprised when the intervention was finally announced. And actually, I don't believe that it was an entirely cynical exercise, because I met with Mal Brough, the then Minister for Indigenous Affairs, and I believe that he was absolutely sincere in his goals, and he remained so even after he lost office. And he tried to work with the Tiwi communities. He was asked by the Anangu Pitjantjatjara, Yankunytjatjara people to work for them, and he did. He went over there to work for them. And you know, he has his admirers in the Aboriginal communities, because what Aboriginal communities desire more than anything else is law and order, a peaceful night's sleep, safety for the children, safety for women. And he was very serious about that. And I think there was certainly an element of political brinksmanship in that pre-federal election period. But, you know, there was much more to it than that. There was so much more to it than that. I think, you know, the whole policy approach had been developing for many years, so I don't think it's true. I don't think it's true that the intervention was, you know, just a political trick pulled out of the pack at the last minute. And, you know, we've been doing research on this for quite a long time. It's very clear that there's this slow accretion of very distinct policy moves away from the old welfarist, sort of semi-protectionist approach. ATSIC was shut down, you'll remember that. There were quite a few changes, and of course it was also very clear that particular people in the Commonwealth Public Service were cherry-picking the ideas coming out of the Cape York Institute, and before the establishment of the Cape York Institute about 4 years ago, Noel Pearson's publications, Our Right to Take Responsibility, for instance. So there was a view developing in the Aboriginal community that the impoverishment of Aboriginal community by being trapped in welfare dependency needed to change, and that there were problems of passivity, failure to be educated, failure to become work ready, to join the workforce. All of these issues needed to be addressed by pulling levers, various kinds of policy levers, to make children go to school, to make parents send their children to school, to deal with the alcohol problem, and so on. But what we found over this very long period was that, well, a number of things, but one was the incapacity or refusal, mostly the latter, of state governments to step up to their responsibilities and deal with the alcohol problems. So the state governments had their liquor commissions, and the liquor commissions were really not responding.
Can I just perhaps hold that thought there, because I know when I was in the Northern Territory towards the end of my time, there was a fairly innovative approach at Groote Eylandt, which meant that there was much more control over people having access to the retail outlet for alcohol, and people needed to be registered and have their bona fides that they could show before they could purchase alcohol. People with records of domestic violence or court orders against them were prohibited from it. So I suppose I'd seen that would have been about 3 or 4 years ago that trial started, some attempts to engage that. I just wanted, Clare, if you could give us a bit of background as to what your government was doing to these sorts of issues that Marcia is describing, some of the antecedent things that I think have been described and probably by many people even at this distance are known about. What were the things that led up to that, like that idea at Groote Eylandt or other ones?
Just to keep it focused on something like the Little Children of Sacred Report. The Little Children of Sacred Report, which I've found that many people haven't actually read, which, you know, everyone has views but hadn't actually read it. One of the things that they said was there were two critical components in tackling child abuse, which they said was small in numbers of perpetrators across the territory, certainly not every community, and made that point very clearly, and said that there had been improvements in the last 15 years. So that's just quoting the report. Alcohol and education were the two things that they focused on in terms of what needed more resources. Said that the territory had been putting significant more energy into tackling those issues, but a lot more needed to be done. So that was the outcome of the Little Children Are Sacred report, which we responded to in a much more significant way in terms of energy and dollars than any other state government did, and more quickly. So just to give a bit of perspective on that, we responded with a $300 million response, more quickly than West Australia did with Sue Gordon's report, or New South Wales did, and we felt that the 98 recommendations they made, we responded to in less than 3 months, which was pretty well, you know, was good going for a government. But on alcohol, Philip, the trial that you referred to, I mean, alcohol has had such a devastating impact on Aboriginal communities. And what we did was we worked with, the first one we worked with was the group community, because they were very keen to do something. We worked with the community. They had a great ownership of the changes that came into place. And you actually needed a permit to buy takeaway alcohol. Maybe in a Melbourne context that sounds draconian, but the community wanted that, the police wanted that, we wanted that. And in 3 to 4 years, it has halved the amount of crime happening on Groote Island, the same with the kind of violence against families, and the work rate from Aboriginal workers at the mine has increased significantly. And that is still in place. It's still very strongly owned by the community, and those same processes of needing a permit or needing to show identification before you can buy takeaway alcohol is now in place and owned by the community of Alice Springs, of Tennant Creek, the Katherine region, Nhulunbuy. So the issue of alcohol needs to have a working through with any community. It needs to be owned by black and white community. And we've seen that come into place right across the territory. And in somewhere like Alice Springs, where the alcohol was being consumed at 3 times the national average, the amount of pure alcohol has been reduced by 17%. That's the consumption has been reduced. And that means less impact on the hospital at emergency, a safer environment for families. Now, it's not the only answer to the problems, but it is certainly a very key one. So a lot of work has been done, and that has been led by the Territory's Liquor Commission.